to introduce our leader today, who is Dr. Alfonso Troisi. He's a professor in the School of Medicine at University of Rome. Alfonso has played a major role in developing evolutionary perspectives on mental disorders. And this includes serving as a co-author of an important book, the 1998 book on Darwinian psychiatry, which has had a huge impact on thinking about evolutionary perspectives on mental health. He's also played a role in clinical application of evolutionary medicine principles. And so with that, I'll turn things over to you, Alfonso. Thank you very much for leading us in this discussion.
Thank you for inviting me. Okay, so the short article that it's the topic of the discussion is an instant paper, because I was invited by the editor of Clinical Neuropsychiatry to write something about the evolutionary viewpoint concerning fear of COVID-19. It's a monographic issue of the journal with different contributions from different perspectives. And what I decided to write was to use the behavioral immune system concept by Mark Schaller as a possible interpretation of different aspects of fear of COVID-19. I think that the work by Mark is very important. I think that the idea that we evolved psychological and behavioral responses to infections, it's really useful for clinicians working in that field. The problem is that, as probably you know, clinical medicine until recently was neglecting infectious disease. When I was in the medical school many years ago, I remember that, you know, infectious disease were considered something of the past. What are important is the fear of new, in evolutionary terms, new diseases like cancer, Alzheimer's disease, and, you know, diabetes, and so on. So changing slide, if I am able to do that. Okay. Meredith, do you know how I can change the slide?
You should be able to navigate the same way you normally do, either with an arrow, or you may have to click the screen.
Okay, so you see the slide now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I examined recent studies about fear of disease in general, and there are many reports, you know, saying that people in rich countries, of course, really fear cancer, Alzheimer's disease, heart disease, stroke, and diabetes. What is interesting in this kind of fear is the fact that people know exactly what are the risk factors, what they should do to limit, decrease, or eliminate risk factors, but they generally don't change. It's very difficult to implement successful prevention programs because people tend to keep the same diet, they keep smoking, they decide not to have physical activity, and so on. Probably the main reason is the fact that there is no emotional participation in this kind of fear. It's something very rational, something that you have to learn. And in my opinion, fear of infectious disease is different because it's based on psychological mechanisms that are really very old in evolutionary terms, because the possibility to get an infection disease is in our evolutionary history. So the key points of the short paper are the following ones. Fear of infection is different from that evoked by other medical conditions. Such a difference depends on psychological mechanisms related to the evolution of the behavioral immune system, and psychological mechanisms to avoid infection have important implications for social interactions and public health programs. The behavioral immune system described by Mark Schaller is very important because it's complementary to the physiological immune system, is proactive. So the physiological immune system is reactive. We have to enter in contact with the pathogens to activate the physiological immune system. Behavioral immune system is not reactive, it's proactive. Before entering in contact with the pathogens, we can avoid infection through some signals coming from possible source of infections. And the basic psychological and behavioral response, according to Mark Schaller, is disgust. It's a very important reaction that we have spontaneously in many cases where infection is likely. So disgust is elicited by stimuli directly related to infection risk, like vomit, feces, skin lesions, body odor, and so on. The problem is that infection is generally invisible when these kind of signals are not present. And so there is something that we can call the widening the appreciation of signals through social mechanisms. So social avoidance of strangers, fear of unknown individuals, and ostracism toward diversity can be something related to avoidance of infection. At first place, this can be absolutely strange to understand, because what is the link between a person that we don't know and the possibility to avoid infection? To understand this point, we have to think about the original ecological situation of our ancestors. So they lived in small bands, high familiarity with known individuals. People coming from outside, they could be a source of infection. And so xenophobia and fear of unknown individuals could be a good defense against infection. Of course, system organized this way is a system with the high possibility of false positive. But here we have to apply the principle described by Randy Nesse, the smoke detector principle. Many systems in evolutionary adaptations function this way. False positives are better than false negatives. So even if sometimes the system is elicited by a false signal, it's much better than ignore a real danger. So the problem is with mismatch, that it's a basic concept in evolutionary medicine. Probably now we are facing a mismatch, because what was really effective and functioning in the ancestral environment, social environment, now in the global village can be absolutely not appropriate, leading to social reactions toward people that are absolutely useless and potentially dangerous. I don't know what is the situation, in the United States, but what I see in Italy is the fact that people are now very sensitive to contact with people they don't know. We had this problem with runners that, of course, want to make, physical activity in the street, on the park, and there were, reactions saying these people are disease spreaders, they should not be allowed to run because this is very dangerous. And so there are overreactions that are linked with fear of disease. At the same time, another aspect that I think it's interesting, it's about the social conformity. Mark Schaller emphasized this aspect, saying that probably the reason was related to social norms, the kind that people prepare food or dispose human waste, And so social conformity originally was related to the respect of these norms. I think that there is something more. I think that in times of uncertainty and fear, unfortunately, people want leaders. People want guru, you know, people that say, we know everything, you know nothing, you have to follow what we say. And I am observing exactly this kind of reactions in Italy, especially in political terms, especially, wanting clear and definitive answers by scientists, even if scientists sometimes have to say, we don't know. And so I think that we can touch some open questions in this discussion. Are evolutionary insights useful to understand social reaction to COVID-19? Are these evolved mechanisms useful just now to prevent infection? And which is the cost-benefit ratio in terms of social relationships? And this is the last question is for people living in my clinical field. Should mental health professionals treat fear of COVID-19 as they treat fear of non-infectious disease like cancer or dementia? This is interesting because now we have some programs for preventing fear in and emotional reactions in mental health professionals, but you know, there are data that these kind of intervention cannot be useful, or even they can be dangerous because they ask people to ruminate about emotions, about fear of infection, and this probably is not useful when you are touching kind of fear that it's very instinctive, very primitive in terms of emotional reactions. Okay, I would like to open the discussion.
Great. So just as a reminder, we'd love for you to ask questions directly. You can do that by using the raise hand function, which you can click participants, and then there should be a raise hand button. But to get the conversation started, I did receive a question via email from Larry Arnhart. Larry says, you say that infectious diseases have exerted strong selective pressure in early human evolution, but aren't most of our infectious diseases so-called diseases of civilization that arose in largely urbanized and globalized world in which communicable diseases could flourish?
Yeah, I think this is a very important point because I was saying that when I was in the medical school, and this was, you know, about 30 years ago, 40 years ago, well, infectious disease were considered something not important in the medical training because they were something of the past. So much attention was on degenerative diseases like, you know, cancer, all the diseases related to aging and so on. So I think that looking at the last 20 years or probably 25 years, we are realizing that the situation is pretty different. We had SARS, we had Ebola, we had MERS. So there are many infectious diseases emerging, and these are not limited to some, you know, areas of the world where the situation in economic terms is so different. So I think that the primitive reactions that we have are in our brain are ready to manifest themselves anytime these infectious diseases hit our social environment, even if in ordinary times they are not important.
Great. So it looks like we have a question from Neha Ship in the chat box. So what is the practical implication of this kind of psychological aspect of fear of infectious disease in a country like India, where maintaining social distancing and maintaining kind of a containment zone is not really feasible?
Yeah, this is another important point because, you know, there are two systems, I think, that are conflicting because we are social animals and social contact is very important for our physical and mental well-being. it's very difficult to remain distant from other people, especially people that we like, people that belong to our social network. In addition, when there are no manifest signals of infections in other people, it's very difficult to maintain distance. So the system, I mean, the behavioral immune system is very effective when we are facing other people with manifest signs of infection, alarming our system. And when other people, even if they have no manifest signs of infection, they are alien, they are strangers, you know, and especially the phenotype is very useful for distinguishing us from them. You know, 1 year ago, before the COVID-19 pandemic, in Italy, we have this problem. Migrants coming from other countries, especially North Africa, they were accused to bring disease in Italy. There was no evidence for that, you know, but they were identified different just thinking about the phenotype, because we don't have in Italy many people with a different phenotype, you know, from the traditional European phenotype. And so there was this linking between you are different, you are not from my country, you are a disease spreader, even if there was no evidence, no scientific evidence of this kind.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So it looks like we do have a couple raised hands. We'll go first to Frank Rulli. Frank, I'm going to unmute you. Okay, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Thanks. Sorry, I missed most of your talk. I was a bit late, but I just referred to your last slide about the open questions. First of all, I think that evolutionary insights are useful, obviously, to understand social reactions. What I realized now, since we are still in the middle of the pandemic, you know, you have different phases. And I see the social reactions of both professionals like MDs, but also of the public being quite diverse in terms of the different phases. You saw like almost a neglectance at the very beginning. Then you had like this overwhelming fear that, you know, everybody gonna die within 1 week. And then you sort of have more of a, now it already turns almost in sort of an anger, you know, who cares? You know, I don't care about this COVID, it doesn't affect me. I was wondering what's your opinion on that? Maybe you touched on this during your talk and I have missed it, but you know, how do we, from an evolutionary perspective, sort of subdivide the different phases of such a pandemic, and what does that have in terms of implications for both professional and non-professional people?
Yeah, I think it depends on the psychological profile of the person, because as a clinical psychiatrist, in these days, I saw very different reactions. There are people that are really scared. They say, you know, this is a big problem and I have a high probability to get COVID. And so they generally are very careful in respecting the social norms that were delivered by the government about social distancing, lockdown, and so on. Other people, you know, they deny completely the problem. It's interesting, you know, they don't see the problem. They say it's just something that they are building for other reasons, you know, for economical reasons, for political reasons. So I don't believe that all this stuff is really useful for protecting us. So the psychological profile, of course, is very important. In addition, you have to consider that we are exposed to mass information. I don't know exactly how many hours of TV shows and news are dedicated to this problem, very often with completely different opinions by experts. This is very confusing for people, because people look at scientists as people with definite answers for everything. So they have to know everything. They have to say just one thing. And this is not possible, of course, because this is a new thing. We don't know exactly what is the, for example, the lethality of the virus. We had very different data in Italy. North Italy, it's about 20% of people with infection, they died. In Rome, for example, the same virus, we have a lethality of about 3%. So what is the real scientific evidence for saying one thing or another? So I think that confusing information, it's very scareful for people, and this can be related to the idea that conformity and authority are so important in these times. And I think that this is very, very dangerous in terms of social organization. I don't know if I reply to your question.
You can go ahead, Frank. You gotta unmute.
Maybe, I was more referring to the different phases, at the very beginning, where we don't know much about an infection and the consequences of the infections versus the later period, and especially when waiting for a second wave, that how that pattern in behavior changes.
What exactly you mean by different phases?
If you're at the beginning of the pandemic, where only a few countries are affected, you try to say, okay, this is a China issue, it's not related to us.
Yeah.
Then it comes to northern Italy, and now it's very close to Switzerland. So everybody's scared. Then we realize it's not that bad. So you have different phases, like almost like Kübler-Ross, how you react to a danger.
Yeah, I think that the phase is in a way shaped by information that we get. I'll give you an example. In Italy, probably in late February, there was really a massive avoidance of all Chinese shops. Even if these people live in Italy, they have no relationship with people living in China. Some of them speak Italian perfectly because they are the second generation. So there was an avoiding of any Chinese shop, Chinese restaurant, and so on. This was related only based on phenotype, okay? So the virus is a Chinese virus. I avoid Chinese people living in Italy. Crazy, because there was no rational evidence for doing that. After about 1 month, when the Chinese started to send some doctors, some experts, some medical staff to Italy, the situation changed completely. So now people ignore Chinese in terms of possible sources of infection, and they choose other targets like runners. So you are Italian, but you are running, you are a disease spreader. I think the kind of information that we get is very important in modifying people behavior. But this kind of situation, it's intermixed with emotional reactions that are based on the behavioral immune system. I'm sure that if you are in a store and there is something coughing or sneezing, now the attention is very high because it's a manifest signal of possible COVID infection. And so it's an emotional reaction. What I was emphasizing in my short paper is that no emotional reaction toward the risk factors for diseases that are common in ordinary times, like a cigarette. If you are talking with a person smoking a cigarette, even if we have data about passive smoking risk and so on, there is no emotional reaction because it's not in our brain. Coughing, sneezing, vomiting is in our brain. So I think that we react to that.
Thanks. So it looks like we have quite a few hands raised. I know Ron Willis had a hand raised for a while. Ron, do you still have your question?
Yes, I do. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think there was a misunderstanding of the first question. The idea about the sort of evolution of this response. And from how I understand it, there have been several million years to evolve a response to, say, poisonous plants and various sort of, areas around that, close contact. But it's not until the past, the agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago, we've lived in cities, that there have been these things like measles and flu. And so I think they're two separate, and there's 10,000 years is not time to evolve this response. So I'd like to hear, an answer to that, please.
Yeah, I think this is an important point, because we have evidence that the pandemics are related to the big change happening with the agricultural revolution. So the contact with many other people and the contact with animals, domestic animals. So I agree. But at the same time, I don't think that the problem of infectious disease started with the agricultural revolution. I think that even in the ancestral environment, these small bands of humans probably get some infectious disease from other people coming from the other bands, because otherwise it's very difficult to explain this tendency to xenophobia that it's observed in many different settings. Of course, xenophobia can be related to other dangers brought by people, like, attacks and, violence and so on. But I think that infectious disease can be related to this reaction as well. So probably if Mark Schaller online, because I think that he can say something about that. I don't think that the viral immune system is just a product of evolution of the last, 10,000 years. I think that there's something more primitive. And so if the system is there, I think that the danger were there.
Mark, are you on, and do you want to speak to this? I was also wondering about this point. I mean, thinking about it as somebody who studies infectious disease in non-human primates, we've done quite a few studies of the patterns of transmission, the types of transmission you see in different species, and by and large, the kind of close contact transmission diseases are pretty absent in a typical non-human primate. It's mostly environmental transmission, vector transmission, so you could imagine that cues like feces in the environment, would be an elicitor of the behavioral immune system, but there wouldn't have been as much selection for social avoidance. The only exception to that is viruses. About 1/3 of the viruses in non-human primates are spread through close contact. But the helminths and protozoa and other organisms were really, in non-human primates are not spread through close contact.
Yeah, can you hear me? Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
I think I would trust somebody who's more expert on human evolution than I to be able to weigh in more smartly than I can on this. My own somewhat amateurish take on it is that probably these tendencies to respond to folks who look or act in a non-prototypical way it's probably relatively ancient, and in response to some of these kinds of things that Charlie is referring to, where there are some kinds of viral infections and so forth, or even if it's some other sort of parasitic infection, close contact, it might not be spread by close contact, but it might be spread through some sort of environmental contamination. So there's probably kind of more of a sense of, we want those people away from us, not necessarily away from me because I have some magical understanding of the transmission of a parasite, but rather I'm just kind of aware when those folks are in the immediate location, then people are more likely to get sick. And so as some sort of kind of a learned superstitious response, my sense is that there's this kind of general tendency for our mind to evolve in such a way to be readily able to learn what the cues are that suggest that somebody, isn't like us in some way, or isn't a normal member of our community. That may be a, you know, some aspect of their, you know, their visual appearance, or it may be simply a, you know, cues that indicate that they're not one of us, and that we learn those things, and then that tends, when we encounter those things in the future, that tends to kind of trigger this this aversive response. So I think that the getting back to the original question is it certainly, it would be, you know, there hasn't been very much time, evolutionary speaking, since the agricultural revolution. Is the, you know, through the agricultural revolution that the threat of infection kind of was transformed into the threat of epidemics and pandemics. But the threat of infection, of course, is much older than that.
Yeah.
Great. So let's bring someone else into the conversation. Looks like Randy Nessie has had a hand raised. Randy, you are unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Alfonso, thanks so much for writing that paper and for leading an interesting discussion. Your slides were great. I'm not, if we don't need them anymore, maybe you can turn them off and we can see you better. Stop the screen share there. But my question is for both you and for Mark. I've always wondered, why the heck doesn't the behavioral immune system work better? And why isn't it more specific? And I would think that natural selection would shape us to run screaming 100 meters away from anybody who coughs or sneezes or has a runny nose. But you know, a lot of people put up with that. It's pretty amazing. And even people go out drinking and vomit and they think it's funny instead of, you know, running in fear. Maybe you've already answered the question, but I'd be curious what you think about that.
Mark, you go first.
I'll go first. I think, Randy, it's a great question. I've wondered the same thing myself. I mean, I know, of course, that that evolution designs things that are kind of essentially better than the realistic viable alternative, rather than the designing things that work optimally. And so, in terms of, you know, the particular example that you raise of why am I not more freaked out? Why am I not more crazily avoidant of anybody who seems to have some sign of infection? I don't actually have any really good idea of that, but I suspect that it may have something to do with the fact that, at least in a lot of social environments and natural environments, there are, let's say, competing objectives, which is to say, sure, I want to avoid people who are sick, but I also I kind of need people, and I want to avoid, you know, foodstuffs that are contaminated, but I also have these kind of powerful appetitive motives that draw me toward things that another way or another look like it might be a viable foodstuff. So, I mean, that might provide some traction on your question, but, you know, I don't think I have anything particularly smart to say about it, and perhaps Alfonso does.
No, I agree that, you know, the problem is that avoiding infection means avoiding other people. And the cost of avoiding other people can be really a big cost in evolutionary terms in a social species. So I think, for example, that, you know, the situation with sexually transmitted diseases is very interesting, you know, because sex, of course, is so important in evolutionary terms that we can tolerate situations that otherwise would be avoided if the prevalence of avoiding infection was so important. You know, look at the example of, you know, the situation with the transmission of AIDS that was so difficult to limit. Because the idea to be infected without evident cues from the other person was of, you know, lower importance than sexual attraction. So I think that your idea, Mark, that there are many different competing systems that go against avoiding infection is absolutely true. This could be related to attachment, for example. This is another important system. When you are with people that you love and you have to help people, even if they are diseased, this is a competing system relative to avoiding infection. I have in mind the example reported by Jane Goodall in chimpanzees when they had this pandemic of polio, with kin relatives helping other chimpanzees, even if there were evident signals of an infectious disease, you know. But if the emotional bond is very strong, I think that we are able to mute the behavioral immune system, and the necessity to help, the necessity to take care is more powerful in some situations.
Great, thank you. So I just want to point out there's a lot of great conversation going on in the chat box, so feel free to read along with those as well. But it looks like we do have another hand raised. So we'll go to Martin Brune. Martin, you're unmuted, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Alfonso. Nice to meet you.
Hi, Martin.
Hi. I have a brief question regarding individual differences in fear of COVID. I mean, there should be individual differences in the strength of fear. So, for example, younger people may be less frightened of the COVID pandemic than older ones. On the other hand, evolutionarily speaking, they would have to lose the most compared to very old people. So that should, in principle, be testable. Do you have any evidence of differences between people in regard of COVID fear?
Well, you know, in Italy, I don't know if it's the same in other countries. We have this problem with very young people, because they hate lockdown. I mean, it's very difficult to keep these people at home, you know. They want to socialize, they want to have sex, and they ignore the danger. Probably this is related to the statistics that we have. You know, we have the statistics that young people generally have a very mild form of the disease, and the real danger is for all people. So they reason this way: I am young, even if I get a COVID, no problem. It's like just a flu. I want to see my friends, I want to see my girlfriends, and so on. They want to stay all together. Of course, this is related as well to the risk behavior propensity that it's typical of young people, especially males. I mean, they tend to under-evaluate, to neglect the dangers. So this is the general framework. Of course, probably there are very important individual differences related to the personality profile. I'm sure that people with high level of neuroticism, with the high level of anxiety, they tend to be very cautious relative to people with a lot of extroversion of, you know, the profile of personality we found in people that we, at the extreme of the distribution we label as sociopathic or, you know, bipolar and so on.
Great, thank you.
May I ask another question, or are there many hands?
We do have another hand raised. If it's a quick follow-up, we can do that. If it'll be.
No, it's not. So.
Okay.
Go ahead. Thank you.
Another person. So it looks like we have Whitney McBara with a hand raised. Whitney, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, yeah. So I'm actually kind of curious about thoughts on like how, for individuals who believe that this is a government-sponsored hoax, does that have any like evolutionary backing? Like, where does that response come from? You know, like, why can't these individuals kind of wrap their mind around the fact that this is something real that came from nature that is happening? And then if there's time, also a question about where we have different racial groups within one community being impacted like extraordinarily differently. So African Americans versus, you know, white individuals, and how African Americans might now see themselves as like, well, if I go outside, I'm going to get coronavirus. So they might change their behavior because of that thought. And so I'm just curious if you have thoughts on those too.
Yeah, this is an important question because what I'm observing is the fact that people are really dividing in very different groups with opposite ideas about what's happening. There are people that tend to conform very strongly to the social norms. So they like all the information they get from the government. They say they are right, we need a strong leader. They have to guide other people because they know exactly what is right. And at the opposite, there are people saying this is an hoax. They are building all this stuff because they want to control our behavior. They want to control our lives. And so we are discussing these days in Italy the delivery of this app. The name is Immuni, to be downloaded on the smartphone, to be followed every day in terms of contacts with other people, because the smartphone send to the database the people you are with, and if there is a positive person, immediately all the others are informed. And some people perceive this situation as just a trick for controlling people across the territory. So I think that it's like a big divide between the perception, what is happening. In my opinion, the situation, it's just something in between. I don't think that all they are saying in terms of government, they are right. In fact, they are changing their ideas very rapidly. At the same time, I don't think that, behind this stuff, there is, some people say that there's Bill Gates is behind all this, pandemia, or the Chinese government, or, the United States, and so on. This is like, people believing in flat earth. So they like to reinterpret everything as a plot. In terms of different racial groups, this is interesting because the phenotypes are important in interpretation of the behavior of people. In Italy, we get information that Black people are immune. This is based on no evidence, just because there were no Black people going to hospitals in Italy with this infection. But the numbers were so small that, of course, there is no, valid database for saying that Black people are immune. The last information that I read just today on the newspaper, there are some doctors saying that addict people, they are immune, because there were no cases of COVID in this community hosting people with cocaine or heroin addiction. And of course, it's no scientific evidence for saying that, but they say they are stressed by addiction. This way, there is no inflammation reaction to the viruses, and the real danger of this virus is the inflammation reaction. It's not the virus by itself. So many different information, but behind any information, there is a target group, a special people that are different from the majority of us. And I think this is really related to the behavioral immune system. We want to know who is the target, who are the dangerous people, who are the disease spreader, and so on.
Yeah, thank you.
Great question. I had a quick question for you, and then I think we'll close with Martin's question since we're getting short on time. My question is that many mental health disorders are associated with overexpression of certain emotions. I'm thinking about anxiety and anxiety disorders, or sadness and depression. And I'm just wondering if the same is true for the emotion of disgust or other emotions that are associated with the behavioral immune system. I know somebody brought up in the chat box obsessive compulsive disorder. I was wondering if that's one, or phobias maybe, or other kinds of you know, mental health disorders that are associated with the emotion of disgust. I was wondering if that's the case, if there is a link, and would this pandemic potentially trigger more cases of those disease, if that's true?
Well, based on my small sample, because of course it's very dangerous to make a generalization, there is a paradoxical reaction. So people with OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, especially people with contamination obsession, they are reacting pretty well. So no worsening of the disorder. The same for people with hypochondriasis. They generally fear disease, but these times I don't see so many patients. What I see are patients that are really suffering lockdown. They, you know, they suffer social distancing. They are saying that they have a lot of, you know, anger because they feel trapped. And so people that apparently are very far from the fear of infection. There is an important implication for the social aspect of the therapeutic relationship. We are working with patients with the mask, and this is completely different. Marty is an expert in nonverbal behavior, and he knows how it's important in the therapeutic relationships to exchange nonverbal signals. And the mask is very disturbing because you are not able to see the emotion or the social signal of the other person during the therapeutic relationships, you know. And patients say that it's not comforting for me to see you with the mask. I see just the eyes, you know. And so this is probably another point that should be studied formally with data collection.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's move on to Martin, and we'll have this be the last question. And I'll just call out again, there's some really great discussion going on in the chat box, and you'll be able to see that in the recording of this, which we'll share with you afterwards. But go ahead, Martin. Oops, I think you're muted. Hold on, start again, you were muted.
Okay. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. I have a question that invites some speculation. I was wondering, the COVID pandemic most likely does not leave a mark on gene selection. So because the majority of people who die from COVID are beyond their reproductive period, and this was different in the huge plague epidemics in the medievals, where 2/3 of the European population died. So my question is, could it be that suspiciousness and paranoia gave a selection advantage at that time, and that perhaps a few cases now diagnosed with schizophrenia or paranoid personality disorder or something are the result of past epidemics? I know it's a wild speculation, but I'm interested in your thoughts about that.
Yeah, you know, I don't know exactly how psychotic patients are reacting, because all the patients that I saw in the last weeks avoided completely this topic. They seem to remain on the kind of problem they had with, you know, hallucinations or paranoid ideas about people they know, but nothing more added by the infection. It's something that, based on my small sample, they don't consider. What they are talking about, it's lockdown. Lockdown is very important because, you know, these people have problem with social relationships. So for some of them, it's scaring because they say, I feel alone, I stay for long hours at home, and this is really bad for my thoughts, for my hallucinations. Other people, instead, they are in a very good condition because they say, finally, I can avoid everyone because I am at home. This is a safe place. I don't want to go outside. And I think that when the lockdown will be over, this will be a big problem for me. I don't want to come back to normality, because normality, it's the kind of life I'm living now.
Okay, any other thoughts on that last question? Anybody else like to weigh in? Okay, I think we'll close things down. Thank you all very much for joining us today. Thank you, Meredith, for organizing and helping guide us through this conversation. I think this is really fascinating and interesting. We will post this video on the, we'll share the link with you, but we'll post it on the TriSem website if you want to go back and see some of the questions in the chat box. We have a great lineup for future Club EvMeds, and I believe next up is Joe Alcock, actually. I think you're the next one up. We also have Dan Blumstein and Terry Taylor, who are going to be going in a couple of weeks. We have Athena Tipis. We'll shift the conversation to some other topics at that point, talking about cancer in the case of Athena. And we have others in the lineup. And so if you'd like to be a part of these conversations, please get on the TriSem listserv and join us in the future. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Meredith. Thank you, Charles.
Thanks,
Bye,
Alfonso.
This is great discussion.
Thanks for